Great, welcome back everyone. Thank you for keeping the energy going. A long day, and it'll be a long evening shortly too, so thank you for your attention. We'll continue on now looking at listening test protocol and actually moving into from objective to subjective, just noticeable differences. And I think it's fascinating when we realize how we can measure sound very clearly and very accurately. However, how do we feel and how do we sense that? So I think that's going to be really interesting. Daniel just coming on stage shortly to start with that. And then we'll move on into education session, which will continue tomorrow morning. And we'll have looking into neurodiversity and actually looking at how active students in their situation respond to motivation from the sound environment as well. So Daniel, please come up and say, Daniel de la Prida, who's from Carlos III, not King Charles, but Carlos III University in Madrid. And yeah, welcome.
Thank you, Colin.
Take us through the listening test protocol. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Ecophone for having me here. And well, Colin already introduced the subject, but I'm going to be talking about listening tests, and in particular, I'm going to be talking about the relevance of the protocol that we use to conduct these listening tests. Okay? You might not completely understand what the protocol is at this point, but we will see it in a few minutes, so no worries about that. So, listening tests. What are they? Why using them? So many of us know what listening tests are. Many of us have conducted listening tests, but just a brief introduction. A listening test is an experimental procedure that we do normally in laboratory conditions, in which we test the differences between the several stimuli, or we assess individual stimuli one after the other, with participants that hear these stimuli and answer some questions regarding that. Okay, so I think Alice already had this explanation in her chat today, but the main focus of listening tests is that they use the human being as an instrument of perceptual auditory measurement. So the same way that we use a sound level method to measure dBs, if we want to assess the perception of the sound or the noise or auditory stimuli, we have to use appropriate instruments for that, and the appropriate instruments for that are human beings. So now we know what listening tests are, and in listening tests we have several entities that are interrelated between each other. We have so many more, but these are the most relevant ones. We have the experimenter, which is designing the listening test, and afterwards we'll analyze the results of it. We have the stimuli that are prepared by the experimenter on the basis of the hypothesis that she or he want to test. We have the protocol, which I will explain a little bit more in detail, but it is how we present the stimuli to the participants and how we get the responses from them. We have, of course, the participants, the hardware that we use to present those stimuli to the participants, and the analysis tools. Okay. The first problem that we encounter regarding listening tests is that all these entities can be subject to bias. So the bias that each of these entities can have can influence the results of the assessment. So we have to be really careful with the bias of each of it. Okay, so listening test protocol. Why is it important to talk about the listening test protocol? Because the listening test protocol actually defines how we present the stimuli to the participants during the test. It also has the influence on how we gather the responses from the participants, and therefore, it also has a really strong influence on the analysis methods that we can employ on the data that we capture from the participants' answers. So I'm presenting just here a couple of very well-known families of protocols. We have some more, but these are the most used in the case of room acoustics and insulation also, which are the scaling tests, in which we present the participants with one stimuli, and then we ask them to rate in one or several scales the agreement or the degree of a certain attribute that they can perceive in this stimulus that we have presented to them. And then we have the difference testing, which is a comparison-wise method of do listening tests. And inside the family of different testing, we can also have two subfamilies, which are the attribute-related listening tests, in which we present several stimuli in each trial, and we ask regarding a certain attribute that it is different from the stimulus A to the stimulus B, or we can have the overall difference testing in which the participants, what they are focused in is in finding somehow the odd sample, the one that it is different. Here we have an example of a protocol of overall difference testing. We have three stimuli, a stimulus A, a stimulus B, and a stimulus C, and one of them is different, and the task for the participants is to find out which one of them is a different one. So overall different testing, I'm going to be focusing on this for a bit, is really interesting when the differences between the stimuli are complex. So when not only one attribute is being changing between the stimuli, but several at the same time, so we cannot, or we should not in some cases, ask a specific question regarding the attributes themselves, but it is more convenient to try to see whether the participants can find a difference or not. So here we have some examples of difference testing. I've already introduced this one, which is called the triangle or the triangular protocol, in which we have three sound samples or three stimuli, and the participants have to find the different one. We also have the constant reference duo trio first. This one has not been really used in acoustics, but it has indeed been used in some other areas of sensory perception. And in this one, we have a reference, which is the same in all the trials, and then we have a stimuli A and a stimulus A and a stimulus B, and the participant has to find which of them, A or B, is the same as this reference that never changed during the whole listening test that we are conducting. Another different, similar to the constant reference duo trio, but we don't have a constant reference, is the ABX. This is really used in acoustics. We have a stimulus A, we have a stimulus B, and then we have a stimulus X. And we are asking the participants which of A or B is the same as X. But in this case, X is not constant during the whole test, but it is changing all the time. So in other areas of, or in other fields of sensory perception, so for example in food theory, so for tasting food products, they have a lot of development regarding the relevance of the protocol in the assessments of the participants, but during my thesis I could not find that in acoustics. I could find some articles like leading in this idea that we don't have many studies in this sense in acoustics, but I couldn't find like real responses about which protocol could be better or worse. In the case of field theory, they have already found that, for example, the constant reference duo trio first is much more powerful to evoke the differentiation in the participants, so they are much more able to find the difference between products if they use this protocol than if they use the other two. So actually, in the case of acoustics, we have a real problem, which is that even when we are assessing the same aim, even when we are trying to assess the same thing, so for example, if we are aiming, different researchers are aiming to find out the J and D, so the just noticeable difference for the reverberation time, they will conduct listening tests, but they will use different protocols, and therefore also in many cases, different analysis tools. I have here an example that we presented some years ago in a conference in Aachen. In this table, we can see several studies that were conducted to define the just noticeable differences of different room acoustical parameters. And as you might see, even though some of these protocols can be somehow similar, but the devil lays in the details, we can see that the protocols are pretty different, so are the analysis methods. Lily Wang, famous researcher in room acoustics, once mentioned that maybe due to this difference in the testing protocols, the results in the J and D, for example, for the C80 that one researcher found and the C80 J and D that some other researcher found was so different. And it was not because the J and D was different, but because the protocol that they were using was so different that with one protocol they were able to find out much more precise definition than with the other. Okay, so since we have seen that in other fields of sensory perception, there has been a lot of research on this, and they actually found out that the protocol is relevant. And since we have so many protocols being used in acoustics, we try to make a contribution towards the homogenization of protocols used in listening testing acoustics, in particular for difference testing, in particular for overall difference testing, because that's especially relevant in some cases, for example, for room acoustics. So what did we do? We were trying to assess the existence of an overall listening test protocol that had greater operational power and lower experimental effects, so lower biased, than some other protocols. We wanted to see whether if we ask the participants in a certain way, their ability to discriminate between between stimuli with subtle differences was better or worse. And for that, we conducted a listening test in which we compare the same stimuli through 7 different protocols. The protocols are here. Some of them have been used in acoustics a lot. So for example, the triangle, the ABX, or the same different. And some other protocols, I extrapolated them from food theory or odor theory or some other areas of sensory perception to see whether the conclusions that they found out in other areas could be applicable to acoustics. So for that, we had to use some stimuli, and in that case, we used an approach of room acoustics, okay? So we used 3 oralizations that were the convolution of an anechoic music signal of 12 seconds with the impulse responses of the same room, but simulated with different degrees of geometrical precision. Okay, so we had 3 stimuli: stimuli S1, stimuli S2, and stimuli S3, and we compared S1 towards against S2 and S1 against S3 to see whether the participants could differentiate them. But the focus of this listening test was not on obtaining whether the participants could differentiate or not, but to see whether they will get different results if we apply different protocols. So the listening test took me quite a lot of time because it was quite long. It was like 1 hour and 10 minutes for each participant, and we had like 134 participants doing that, so it was pretty long time. We were actually doing that during the COVID. That's why you saw that a picture of, or that image of participant with the face mask. And well, shocking news, we found out that through different protocols, the differentiation that the participants could find out, so the discrimination that they could find between the different stimuli was really big. So some protocols were really bad. I'm presenting here a graph in terms of a D prime measure. I will explain what the D prime measure is in a couple of minutes, but you will have to keep in mind that if the D prime is going to 0, that means that the participants could not differentiate the stimuli between themselves, and if it is getting high, then it means that they were able to distinguish the stimuli a lot, okay? So we had a lot of discrimination with the constant referent duo trio first, and we had really bad discrimination with some other protocols that had been used a lot in acoustics. So the protocol has a direct impact on the precision of the perceptual assessment. We also evaluate some other things, like, for example, the experimental effects, so some biased. And we found out a strong sequence effects or bias for example, for the triangle protocol. And we also saw some learning tendency, which is also an experimental bias for some other protocols, even though it was not significant. So we use Thurstonian models for this. I'm not going to bore you with a profound explanation on this, but basically what the Thurstonian models are trying to to suppose is that we can suppose that the perception of a certain stimuli or an attribute of a certain stimuli can be described by a Gaussian distribution of neural input. Okay, so if we are comparing two stimuli in one test, we will have two Gaussian distributions, and the far apart they are is the measure of the discrimination that the participants can see. Okay, so if the stimuli are easy differentiable, d prime will be big. If they are somehow differentiable, we will have a lower value of d prime, and if they are barely differentiable, the Gaussians will be high overlapped, and d prime will be really low. Okay. I had some examples here of the use of difference testing of these specific protocols with high operational power and of the Thursdonian models, so the d prime measure for sound insulation. Okay, we use it in a sound insulation listening test. We use the d prime measure that we could get from the results of the test. We got the sound reduction index, which was what the participants were comparing. We use an optimization algorithm on the basis of a paper of Valtari, and we were able to obtain an optimized reference for the calculation of the single number quantities, which is something that we use a lot in sound insulation. You can use it a lot also in room acoustics to see whether, for example, these two impulse responses can be considered as different or not for the participants in terms of perceptual evaluation. And I was about to present also some results of this same procedure for the speech intelligibility. So we measure the frequency response and the directivity of different face masks. And then we did some oralizations with a virtual model, and that allows us to see whether with different face masks, the intelligibility changed for participants or not. So that was pretty much all. I had to run a little bit at the end, but if anyone is interested in detail in this, just approach me during the Congress, and we will have a chat about it. So thank you very much.